Okay, let's talk about the final exam. I sent out this document in an email. It's also on Schoology under assignments and then exams. So you can find it there or in your email. Basically, this is the same as the midterm, except for that it's the final. So you will have 160 minutes to complete the final exam on Schoology. I'm having my FA posted to the main course page. You are welcome to take the exam anytime between Tuesday, May 5th at 11:15 a.m. through Thursday, May 7th at 1:55 p.m. So I'm making the final exam available. I think that's the first day. It's corresponding with the other classes' final schedule. And then you will have 2 days to take it. You can take it anytime you want to during those within this period, as long as you finish it before Thursday, May 7th at 1:55 p.m. It is open book and open notes. I would highly discourage trying to look things up like on a secondary source online, just because it's gonna lead you astray most likely. And then once you finish, please write out and then take a picture of and then send to my FA the statements that is listed below. The format is exactly the same as the midterm. There will be 2 sections. First section will have 4 questions and each will ask for short answers. So you will be asked to answer 2 of these questions in approximately 5 sentences each. There'll be a second section. 4 questions will be on the exam, asking for long answers. You will be asked to answer 2 of these in approximately 20 sentences each. There are the totals for those 2 sections. Oh my gosh, it's a fox. Guys, I see a fox. It's 20 yards away from me.
Show us.
I wish this computer were turned around. You could see it. He's like running down the path. Oh, man.
You guys remember that song, What Does the Fox Say?
Ring a ding ding ding.
Ding 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 ding.
Please don't make me remember that, please. I beg you.
Too late, Beth.
Now, where were we? Here are things that you should study. Make sure that these are like the building blocks that you might want to know in order to answer these questions really well. So I will not ask about Plato's Republic, Huxley's Brave New World, anything about Bloom or music, transhumanism with Leon Kass, or C.S. Lewis's Learning in Wartime. So only what we've covered since spring break. For Aristotle, you should know what Aristotle means when he says that human beings are by nature political animals. You should be able to discuss his exploration of whether or not there are natural masters and natural slaves. You should be able to discuss the best regime, both in theory and in practice, for Aristotle. Moving to Augustine, the foundation of the 2 cities, the difference between earthly and heavenly peace, the relationship of pride and anxiety, and how Augustine interprets that passage from Matthew where Jesus instructs us to turn the other cheek. And then Aquinas, the 4 essences of law, the 4 kinds of law. What are they? What do they do? Why are all 4 necessary? In fact, those questions right there are pretty good for the final exam. So, you know. For natural law, make sure you are able to discuss self-evidence and the first and secondary precepts. And then continuing, the law's attempts to promote virtue and restrain vice. And then today, let's talk about, are we obligated to obey unjust laws? Note the distinction between divine good and the earthly good. So here we are. You have this document in your email and it's on Schoology. Again, you may take the final exam anytime between these two times. So you begin anytime on Tuesday or Wednesday, and as long as you finish on Thursday before 1:55 p.m. Eastern, you're golden. I will have your papers graded by the end of the day Monday, as I said on Tuesday. What questions do you have as we wrap up?
Just the actual format of the quiz, is it the same as the midterm? So like you type into little boxes?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Cool.
You are welcome to like type it in a Word document, maybe save your work as you go along. I'd recommend doing that just because, man, that would really stink.
No kidding.
You know, the internet goes out and then it doesn't work.
Yeah.
So I would type it in a Word document and then copy and paste it into the little boxes. But you don't have to do that. As long as it gets into Schoology eventually.
Awesome. And you can't, there's no way to like make it available for like Monday.
You want it available Monday?
Well, probably just, I mean, if it was possible to do that, that would be awesome. Just
Okay.
because, I don't know.
I'll need to email my FA to give her that update, but sure.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Sure, yeah. And the end date will still be the same. I need to impose the end date so that like I have time to grade it. You know what I mean? Like I can't have it go till Friday, or otherwise I won't be able to have time to grade it. Sweet, says Beth. All right. What other questions do you have? Here we go. Okay, so we have been discussing for the last couple of class sessions Aquinas' Treatise on Law, questions 90 through 97 in the first part of the second part of Aquinas' Summa. So far, we have learned about the four essences of law, which correspond to Aristotle's four causes. We have learned about the way that the law attempts to promote virtue by restraining the worst kinds of vices. And we also have seen that the insufficiency of law in really accomplishing the formation of virtue, because it reaches actions, external actions, and not the interior movements of the heart, and for a number of other reasons. Today, let's talk about the law and justice. So last class, we talked about the law and virtue. Today, let's talk about the law and justice. The question that Aquinas asks in question 96, article 4 is, are we obligated to obey unjust laws? Are we obligated to obey unjust laws? This is a weird way of expressing this question. We Americans, we were born in revolution. We have a keen sense of right and wrong, yeah? Our nation was founded in revolt against an unjust government. And so the question we ask as modern Americans is, when do we get to revolt? The question Aquinas asks, following the Christian tradition, especially found in Romans 13, is it leans in the other direction. Dispositionally, it leans towards obedience rather than disobedience to the law. So this does not mean, by the way, that all unjust laws get a free pass, but rather dispositionally, we are inclined as Christians to obedience to the law. So the question is like, when are we obligated to obey unjust laws? The question is not, when do we get to violate unjust laws? It's the same, we're getting at the same question, but Aquinas asks it from a different perspective. And I think this helps us see that like, dispositionally, he leans towards obedience to the law. if this is still a little confusing, maybe this metaphor helps. For us modern Americans, politics is a sea of revolution with an island of obedience to the law. For Aquinas, politics is a sea of obedience with an island of disobedience to unjust laws. This is different than the way we think of things. Mark, I see Mark says unjust laws are created through unjust processes, i.e. a lack of representation of a certain group or a denial of rights. So no. So no as in, so no, we do not, are we obligated to obey unjust laws? Yeah, hold that thought. That's an excellent point. And I think Aquinas is at least in large part in agreement with you. Let's walk through the argument first though. So the purpose of government. Romans 13 is the place to go if you want to learn. If there's one place in the Bible to learn about the biblical stance on politics, if you only had to pick one, Romans 13 is probably the way to go. And it seems to say, like, not what we wanted to say. I think it's important, though, to realize the structure of the argument. So on the left side of the screen, you should see that, the phrase chiastic structure. Chi is the Greek letter that looks like an X. So you can kind of see and try to make it work there, that the argument goes A, B, C, B prime, A prime, B prime mirroring B, A prime mirroring A. The only thing that is not mirrored or repeated is the center of the argument, the most important part of the argument, the climax of the argument, which is C. So, Romans 13 encourages us to submit to authority. Let me read that real quick. Romans 13, 1 through 7, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. And I didn't include this in your reading, but we might as well have. Verse 8 says, owe to no one anything except to love each other. For the one who loves another has fulfilled the law. Sarah pointed out, I think in response to Mark's comment, that the passage from Romans does seem to tell us to submit to authority. Well, it does. Notice A, submit to authority because all authority is from God. This is what Jesus says to Pontius Pilate as well. Pontius Pilate says, you should respect me because I have the authority over your life. And Jesus responds, you have no authority except what was given to you by God. B, political authorities judge and punish wrongdoing and commend good things. That is what they do, according to Romans. C, government then is for your good. Government is not simply the badge of lost innocence, as Thomas Paine says. It is rather essential for keeping order in the world, and as Aristotle says, it's essential for helping us fulfill our natures, for we are communal, rational animals. Government is instituted for your good. And then the argument comes back down the mountain. Political authorities bear the sword, so submit to the authorities for both reasons of conscience and also prudence. This seems so foreign to us, right? As Americans who bristle under unjust laws, even taxes, right? It says, Romans says, give taxes to whom taxes are owed. The American founders say, yeah, right. You don't have the right to tax me unless I give you the rights to do that. So how can we try to square this circle? Or how can we try to resolve some of these paradoxes? Aquinas asks, what if the laws are unjust? Being a little facetious here, but like in the vast scope of human history, haven't there been a few laws here and there, every now and then, that are unjust? Are we obligated to obey those laws? Aquinas answers this question in 2 different articles. So turn with me to question 95, article 2. Here he is pretty clear. He condemns unjust laws as corruptions. Let me read the response in question 95, article 2. As Augustine says, a law that is not just does not seem to be a law at all. Hence, something has the force of law to the extent that it shares injustice. Now, in human affairs, something is called just by virtue of its being right, according to the rule of reason. But as is clear from what was said above, the first rule of reason is the law of nature. Hence, every humanly made law has the character of law to the extent that it stems from the law of nature. On the other hand, if a humanly made law conflicts with natural law, then it is no longer a law, but a corruption of law. Here, Aquinas emphatically rejects legal positivism, this theory that justice is only what the people in authority say that it is. Humanly made laws are unjust to the extent that they depart from the natural law. This natural law is universal, permanent, eternal. And it is a standard by which we can judge human laws. So Aquinas, he doesn't simply say, well, yeah, whatever the government says is right, and so just shut up and listen, shut up and obey. No, he says, laws that depart from the natural law, human laws that depart from the natural law, are not laws to the extent that they depart from the natural law. The last phrase that I read there was a corruption of law. That's a pretty good translation of it. You also might call it a putrefied carcass of a law. A perversion. It's rotten. When was the last time you saw some rotten fruit? Is it fruit still? Well, strictly speaking, no, because it is departing from its ripeness. But, I mean, it does retain some aspects of fruitness. So, is it a law? Is a humanly made law that departs from natural law a law? It's a corruption of the law. A nasty, smelly, disgusting perversion of the law. And yet, it's not completely not a law, if that makes sense. I had a thought. What was the thought? Shoot. It's a putrefied carcass of a law. Oh, sorry. The reason that a unjust law is not totally evil is that it still exists. So getting into some a little bit deep philosophic waters here. But according to Augustine and Aristotle following, being is good. Simple existence is a good thing. And so nothing that exists is completely evil, because if it were completely evil, then it couldn't exist, because existence is a good thing. I have on the screen here a picture of the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial in Washington, D.C. It is his letter from a Birmingham jail that quotes from these passages in Augustine and Aquinas. A law that is unjust is a law that departs from the natural law, and it is a corruption of law. Rotten, maybe to the core. And so MLK says, I have a duty to disobey this law. I'm going to pause for a minute and look at the chat. So there is no unjust regime that exists, asks Mark. Close. There is no 100% unjust regime that exists. You may want to think about it this way. Even unjust regimes provide a sort of peace. Now, I'm not praising unjust regimes, right? I enjoy calling Kim Jong-un Sampung, third fat. He's the third fat tyrant of North Korea. And if he is removed from office, thank goodness, because he is an oppressor of his people, and so his regime is evil. But the fine philosophical point that Aquinas wants to make is that it cannot be completely evil if it exists, because existence is a good thing. All human laws are unjust that violate the natural law. You see how there's like degrees here? I mean, Plato, remember from first part of class, he might say something like, there's no such thing as perfect justice in the world. And so all law is, strictly speaking, unjust. But Augustine and Aristotle and Aquinas following, they point out that there's degrees of injustice. Certainly, some regimes are better than others. So I don't know how, Mark, if that answers your question. I think Plato would say, yes, all laws are unjust because they are not perfectly just. I think Aquinas would respond, okay, but there are degrees of injustice.
How would Aristotle respond?
Good question. Let's continue, because I think Aquinas' second answer is very Aristotelian. He is, as I have too simply put, the Christian Aristotle. The second way he answers this question is in question 96, article 4. Question 96, article 4. I'm going to read a passage that starts on page 64 in my book. In this article, Aquinas divides unjust laws into laws that violate the divine good and laws that are contrary to the human good. Let me read. This is like the second or third paragraph in the response of question 96, article 4. On the other hand, there are two ways in which laws are unjust. First, in counterpoint to what was said above, they are unjust when they are contrary to the human good. Either A, because of their end, as when the lawmaker imposes burdens on his subjects that contribute not to the common welfare, but to his own greed or glory. Or B, because of their author, as when someone makes laws that go beyond the authority entrusted to him. Or C, because of their form, as when burdens are distributed unequally over the multitude, even if those burdens are ordered toward the common good. Laws of this sort are outrages rather than laws, since, as Augustine puts it, what is not just does not seem to be law. Hence, laws of this sort do not bind in conscience, except, perhaps, for the sake of preventing scandal or social unrest, in which case a man should cede his right in accord with Matthew 5:40-41. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him another 2, and if someone takes away your coat, give him your cloak as well. The second way in which laws can be unjust is by being contrary to the divine good, as are tyrannical laws that induce men to idolatry or to doing anything else that is contrary to divine law. It is not permissible to obey such laws in any way at all, since, as Acts 5:29 says, we must obey God rather than men. Okay, so there's a lot to unpack in what we just read, what I just read. Laws can be contrary to the divine good. I know that that was the second one Aquinas listed, but I think it's the easier one to understand, and so start there. The problem is that it commands us to sin. A law requires us to worship some other God besides Yahweh, or to do anything else that is contrary to divine law. Our response is simple. We must disobey. Sarah, you have your hand up. Talk to me.
Hi. So I was kind of wondering, he talks about like the Matthew 5:41, if someone forces you to go a mile, like go another 2. And then in Romans it talks about that too, where it's like in Romans 12, 7:14, it says like, bless those who persecute you, bless and do not curse. And so when it comes to the unjust law, I'm thinking that Aquinas is kind of contradicting what the verses say. I mean, I don't know how literal to take these verses too.
Yeah. Hey, this is why it's so much fun to study Augustine and Aristotle. Scripture, and I wholly believe that it is inspired by God, it is the holy word of God, but it doesn't, like, there's ambivalences here, there are paradoxes that we need to use our reason in order to figure out what it's actually saying. Okay, so Romans 13 says, obey the authorities. Acts 5:29, which Aquinas just quoted, says, obey God, not the authorities. And notice in the reply to objection 1 in question 96, article 4, so like immediately after, he's talking about Romans 13. So Aquinas is really helpful in unpacking this. And so thank you for bringing that up. How does he try to resolve this paradox? He does so, I think it's helpful to still keep on this track. When something is contrary to the divine good, there is no question. You must disobey. An example of something that is contrary to the divine good. Well, can you think of anything? What is a law that expressly commands sin?
You could use the example of Parks and Rec, the like TED Day.
Okay.
I mean, it's just to go simple. I mean, you could also use like the Holocaust, but you can mainly use like TED Day.
Someone in the last class brought up a reading of like doctors who said, well, we had to obey the law and help execute these people because that's what the law was. No. A law that requires you to murder innocent people is requiring you to sin. And you must disobey. You must obey God rather than men. You should do this. I mean, Augustine might say your first loyalty is to the heavenly city. And so if your loyalty to the heavenly city conflicts with your loyalty to the earthly city, yeah, you got to take the one that comes first, the priority. You have dual loyalty, but one comes first. You might also say that this is just like a prudential calculation, right? Paul says something like this, like, I think that's also in the Psalms, like, don't be afraid of someone who can hurt your body. Be afraid of someone who's in charge of your soul. So what does Jim Elliot say? He is no fool who gives up what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. So it's like a common sense, practical thing to obey God rather than men. Like trying to get like, who do you obey? Your boss or your boss's boss? I mean, all other things being considered, your boss's boss has more authority, so obey her. We are to obey God rather than men. A good example that always comes to my mind is the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They're literally commanded to bow down before the idol of the king Nebuchadnezzar, and they say, no, thank you. This is very easy to understand, but very hard to do. How might you become capable of such a courageous action? By doing a bunch of little things every day, strengthening your spirited muscle of your soul, so that when the big moment comes, when it's time to join Helmholtz, you can, unlike Bernard, jump into the fight. Train your spirited muscle over time. Form those habits. Real easy to understand, really hard to do. The laws that are contrary to the human good are a little bit more difficult to understand, or like to get what Aquinas is saying about them, but I think we can still do it. Human laws that are lacking one of the 4 causes of law are unjust. So remember, the final cause is that it is for the common good. And Aquinas says here, when a law is imposed for the good of the lawgiver and not the people on whom the law is applied, that it is unjust. When the law is for personal gain rather than for the common good, that law is unjust. The efficient cause, the author. If the author attempts to make a law that he or she or they is not qualified to make, that they don't have the authority to make, that law is unjust. You can think of people who try to usurp authority. What's a good example? President Xi Jinping of China recently did this, like in the last couple of years. He extended his term, and I think abolished term limits as well. Does he have the authority to change the character of the election, to change the character of his own office? Does he have the authorship, the authority to do that? I think Aquinas would say that's an unjust law. The form. The law must apply equally over the multitude, even if the goal is the common good. If there are unequal distribution of burdens, or if rights are unequally protected, as I think Mark was starting to bring up, that is unjust. It is this in particular that Martin Luther King Jr. says is unjust about the Birmingham law. When he's imprisoned, MLK is imprisoned because he protested without a permit. And he says in the letter, there is nothing fundamentally unjust about a law requiring protesters to procure permits. A lot of peace, I like that. But when those permits are denied to a class of people simply because of the color of their skin, that is unjust. The application of a good law, the unjust application of a just law is still unjust. Finally, the material cause. A law could criminalize, so the material cause was promulgated. the law has to be announced in some official capacity. The requirement is that in order to be just, the law must be known by the people on whom it applies. So our Constitution, the American Constitution, I think does a good job with this requirement of just laws. It forbids ex post facto laws. Laws that criminalize past behavior that, when done, was not illegal. So you can't like retroactively punish someone for something that wasn't a crime when she was doing it. That's unjust. Because the person has to be able to know that the thing that he or she is doing is unjust. So there are a variety of ways that something can be contrary to the human good. We had an interesting discussion in the last class about Jim Crow laws. Are they contrary to the divine good or to the human good? Perhaps both. Insofar as Jim Crow laws required the mistreatment of people simply because of the color of their skin, it seems that it is commanding sin. That's contrary to the divine good. Insofar as Jim Crow laws put disproportionate burdens on persons of color, that seems contrary to the human good. It's the unequal distribution of burdens. That's contrary to the human good. If the response to laws that are contrary to the divine good is clear, the response to laws that are contrary to the human good is a little bit murkier. So Aquinas says, I read this already, but let me read it again here at the bottom right of the screen. Laws of this sort do not bind the conscience, except perhaps for the sake of preventing scandal or social unrest. Sarah, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify. One of the questions I think I think it was the last quiz was defining the divine good, and I'm not sure if I had it 100% then, and I was wondering if you could just clarify that, because like I just want to make sure I got it like down.
Yeah, good question. This is maybe a little too simplistic, but the divine good is like the good of our eternal souls. And the human good is like the good that we have as human beings on earth. But that distinction, it gets a little bit murky, because certainly things that are bad for us as human beings on earth are also bad for it could be bad for our souls.
Right. So when you're talking about the Jim Crow laws and that being like a murky one, to me, like it seems not to be murky. It seems like very much like more of a human good. But
I agree. And that's actually what I was trying to say in the last class. The student pointed out, however, that many Jim Crow laws required segregation. So let's think of that law from Louisiana that was upheld by the Supreme Court in the 1896 case Plessy v. Ferguson. That law required railway car operators to separate people by race. So in that sense, it required the mistreatment of another human being, which the requirements for doing that is what makes it a little bit murky. Like that does seem like it's a bad thing. And requiring that sort of hatred does that require hatred for another human being? If so, then it's against the divine good. I see what you're saying, however, which is what I was saying before, because it imposes unequal distribution of burden and unequal protection of the laws, that seems to fit more in the category of contrary to the human good.
Thank you. Thank you for clarifying that.
My pleasure. Thank you for asking questions. What do we do about laws that are contrary to the human good? Note again that Aquinas asks not, well, we don't need to obey them, or we get to revolt against them. No, it's that they do not bind the conscience, except for prudential reasons. So when you are considering the relative costs and benefits of revolting or civil disobedience, you must take into consideration two additional things. The question is not simply, well, is this law good or bad? Yes or no? Well, if it's bad, then get rid of it. If it's good, then keep it. It is rather, when you're doing the cost-benefit analysis, you have to take into consideration these extra two things. One, scandal. Two, social unrest. I think social unrest is a little bit, well, let's do scandal first. If when revolting or disobeying the law, even if it's an unjust law, you have to be careful not to encourage others to sin. So this doesn't mean that you should not disobey unjust laws, but it does mean that you should be very careful about how you are disobeying unjust laws. Especially because people who are weaker in spirit and maybe younger than you are watching how you act. And so, it's not, so another example, I think it's in 1 Corinthians, it says yeah, you can eat whatever you want. There's nothing sinful about eating food, but be careful that by eating food, you're not causing others to stumble. So there's this long debate about whether or not Christians could eat pork. And Paul says, yeah, it's not like a sin to eat pork, but some people have been brought up in the Jewish customs, and if they were to see you doing that, then it might cause them to stumble and turn away from the faith. So you have the freedom to eat pork if you want to, but do it in a way that doesn't cause others to stumble. Second, social unrest. Remember that you're not just trying to overthrow unjust laws. You are also trying to replace those laws with better laws. So who knows? I brought up North Korea a minute ago. Who knows if Kim Jong-un is alive or dead, or apparently had a botched heart surgery, or it's unclear what's happened, and they're very forthcoming in all their information. So, but the goal is not simply to remove him from office. Let's assume that happened because of some sort of revolt. The goal is not simply to remove him from office. The goal is to replace unjust laws with just laws. Almost every revolution in the history of the world has gone sour. We Americans were born in revolution, and it worked out pretty well for us, right? We were able to maintain some stability under the Articles of Confederation, and then we adopted a constitution to form a more perfect union. And, it's gone pretty well for the last 200 or so years. This is the exception to the rule, not the rule. This doesn't mean that there's no place for revolution, but rather it's like America ran across a busy street, dodged cars, and made it to the other side, and then looked back and said, "Hey everyone, follow us." And then basically everyone else got hit by a car. So the question is not simply we'll just tear down unjust laws, but rather in this cost-benefit analysis, we need to ask the prudential question, is it likely, is it possible that we can achieve something better? So we're not just trying to replace Kim Jong-un with his sister, who apparently is more vicious, more tyrannical, more oppressive. That's not the goal. So be careful when you're disobeying unjust laws. Sometimes the confusion, commotion, and disorder that is caused by that is actually worse than the disease. So this doesn't mean like don't treat the disease, but it does mean be careful that you have like a way of improving laws, not just tearing down laws. It's real easy to tear down. It's very easy to tear down. It is next to impossible to build up. My 2-year-old knows this, right? We have these blocks, and it takes forever to build a big tower. Not forever. It's possible. You can do it. It's happened in human history before. But it all comes down in a second. So, like, in the cost-benefit analysis of whether you should obey or disobey unjust laws, take into consideration like the relative injustice or justice of the law, and whether or not there's like a good chance that you will be able to improve. Most of the time, revolutions replace one tyrant with an even worse tyrant. And then the people get mad again, and they replace that even worse tyrant with an even worse tyrant. And so things ultimately don't get much better. So the reason I think that Aquinas and even Romans throw their rhetorical weights behind obedience to the law is not because law is like great all the time, but rather that often some law is better than no law. And often revolutions result in no law, which is about the worst thing that you can get. Aquinas is the Christian Aristotle and says, and remember Aristotle says like, hey, be careful when you're changing traditional laws. Because you're opening the door to social unrest. Social unrest is like a colloquial way of saying bloodshed in the streets, a failed state. I love then how Aquinas ends this in the reply to objection 1. So right after where I was reading, question 96, article 4. As the apostle says in Romans 13, 1 through 2, every human authority is from God, and so whoever resists that authority, or whoever resists that authority in the things that pertain to the scope of that authority is resisting God's ordinance. Aquinas says, yeah, sometimes you must disobey unjust laws. Well, certainly when it's contrary to the divine good. And when it's contrary to the human good, well, you need to make a prudential calculation about the relative costs and benefits, the possibility of successfully transferring from unjust laws to more just laws. That doesn't always happen. Abby asks about speed limit laws. I think that you should, if it's 65, I usually go a little bit faster than 65. But I'm a weird politics professor. So I actually, when I catch myself speeding, I like tell myself, my elected officials made this law. And so indirectly, I made this law. I'm a self-governing human being. So I try to obey the law. Yes, I know that makes me weird. 65 equals 105, says Sean. Oh wait, I have one more screen. Thank you for a wonderful class. This has been so fun. It was so much fun talking with you about justice in the Republic and distraction and the formation of habits, Brave New World, and the importance of law and the role of Christian citizens throughout. This has been a lot of fun. I wish I could be in the same room as you all, give you like maybe a nice handshake, or be able to see all of your facial expressions as opposed to like, this has been so fun. Thank you.
Thank you for making it such a great class, Professor.
Well, shucks, thank you.
Couldn't have said
We're-
it better myself, Sean. Truly. Thanks, Professor. It was great.
Pleasure was
I was really
mine.
lamenting having to take a politics class, so thank you for making it a really good time.
That's my
Yes,
favorite
well
thing to
best
hear.
said. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. Hey, by the way, we're done. So,
And every other subject I've ever taken. So helpful, you know?
I'm glad you found it worthwhile. It actually, I think is a pretty fun subject.
Yeah.
What do I mean by fun?
The
I mean, like,
articles from Cass and Lewis, though, those really helped add in, like, I don't know, the applicability to all the different areas. It was really cool that you assigned those.
oh, thanks. I'm glad you enjoyed those.
Yeah, I really appreciated how a lot of it seemed to like work for our current circumstances among like quarantine and all that. Like it turned out to be a lot more beneficial for like, I don't know, there were times whenever your lessons were like weirdly timed for something that I needed to hear or learn at the time.
God moves in mysterious ways.
Unjust laws. All those internet videos of like cops showing up to people's houses and playgrounds and stuff, just like, hey, you can't have your kid playing. Hey, 6 feet apart. But she's my wife. Have you seen that video? Where it's like the cop shows up. Hey,
No, I want to enjoy my day.
and
So
the guy is like, but she's my wife.
prove it.
Well, thank you, Professor. Signing off.
Sarah, so good to see you.
Thank
Good to
you
see
so
you.
much. I really
Bye.
appreciate it.
Thank you.
Bye, Beth.
Well, I'd love to stick around for like 3 more hours.
See you later, Professor. Thanks for a great semester.
John, it was so good to get to know you.
And he's gone.